Adrian Cole adjusted the cuff of his custom-tailored navy suit as he stepped out of his sleek black Mercedes and helped Tonia from the passenger seat. The evening air in Victoria Island carried a gentle breeze, the kind that made expensive perfume linger in the air. Tonight was supposed to be about celebrating their 3 months together. 3 months of public appearances, whispers in social circles, and a kind of easy luxury Tonia seemed to soak in effortlessly. As they walked into Lagos' most exclusive rooftop restaurant, the city lights glittered beneath them like 1,000 diamonds scattered on black velvet. Adrian wanted to forget everything else tonight, the crushing boardroom negotiations, the family drama, and the unresolved shadows of his past. The maitre d' ushered them to a private corner table, the soft glow of candlelight flickering against their champagne flutes. Tonia was radiant in a red silk dress that clung to her curves, her smile polished, but tinged with that ambition Adrian found both attractive and dangerous. They had just settled in, the waiter pouring their first glass of wine, when a subtle shift in the air caught Adrian's attention. The clink of glasses, the hum of quiet conversations, and then her voice. Soft, low, unmistakable. His chest tightened before he even turned his head. There she was, Clara, his ex-wife, wearing a plain black waitress uniform, her once elegant figure now softened by the undeniable curve of late pregnancy. Her hair, once carefully styled for society events, was pulled back into a simple bun, a few loose strands clinging to her damp forehead. She didn't falter when their eyes met, no gasp, no stutter. Just a professional, unreadable mask as she greeted them. The rest of the world seemed to fade for Adrian, but Tonia's curious glance cut through his shock. He forced a smile and looked away, but the champagne suddenly tasted bitter on his tongue. Adrian tried to bury himself in conversation, but Tonia was far too observant to miss the tension. "Do you know her?" she asked casually, but her eyes were sharp, studying him. He dismissed it with a light shake of his head, yet his gaze kept drifting back to Clara as she moved between tables with quiet efficiency. The sound of her laughter, faint and different now, with a tired edge, still sent an ache through him. How had she ended up here, serving food to strangers, when she used to sit at the head table in his own banquets? Clara avoided his table as much as possible, letting another waiter handle most of their service. But at one point, she had no choice but to place a dish in front of Tonia. Adrian noticed the faint trembling of her hand, though her voice remained steady. Her eyes, however, flickered briefly to his, not with anger nor longing, but with something far worse, indifference. That cold distance pierced him deeper than rage ever could. Tonia leaned back in her chair, swirling her wine with slow precision. "She's pregnant," she said bluntly, watching Adrian's reaction with thinly veiled interest. He forced a small laugh, pretending to be unfazed, but his mind was already spiraling. Memories of their last night together before the divorce came unbidden. The way she had cried, the way she had tried to tell him something he didn't have the patience to hear. He had walked away then, convinced she had betrayed him. But now, the timeline of her pregnancy and the unspoken questions clawed at his thoughts. Back at home that night, the luxurious silence of Adrian's penthouse felt oppressive. He poured himself a drink, staring out at the city skyline, but his mind wasn't on the view. Instead, it replayed moments from a different time, when Clara was his wife. They had met at a business conference in Abuja, her laughter the brightest sound in the room. She wasn't dazzled by his wealth back then, and maybe that's what drew him in. He remembered the way she would challenge his ideas, the way she refused to be a trophy wife. She had been his partner in every sense, until the cracks appeared. Those cracks had come in the form of rumors. Whispers of her closeness with Daniel Ajayi, Adrian's fiercest business rival. He had confronted her, and she had denied everything, but the seed of doubt had been planted. One overheard phone call, one late night she couldn't explain. It had been enough for him to throw away 6 years of marriage. He'd filed for divorce without ever giving her the chance to truly defend herself. Pride had been his armor, and bitterness his comfort. Now seeing her pregnant, working long shifts in a restaurant, Adrian felt something he hadn't expected. Not pity, but guilt. What if she had been telling the truth all along? What if she had been carrying more than her own pain when he left? His thoughts tangled into knots he couldn't undo, and for the first time in years, he realized he didn't know the whole story. The next morning, Tonia padded into the living room in a silk robe, sipping her coffee with deliberate grace. "You were quiet last night," she said, settling into the couch beside him. Was it about her? Adrian didn't answer immediately, flipping through a newspaper he wasn't reading. Tonia's tone was casual, but her eyes were sharp and calculating. She was the kind of woman who didn't just want his attention. She wanted control of it. "You're imagining things," he finally replied, but Tonia smirked. "Am I?" You looked at her like you'd seen a ghost. Her words hung in the air, heavy with insinuation. Adrian tried to change the subject, but she persisted, asking who the woman was, how he knew her, and why seeing her seemed to rattle him. He refused to give her a straight answer, knowing any truth he shared could turn into a weapon later. Tonia didn't push further, but Adrian could see the wheels turning in her mind. She wasn't the type to let go of something that could be useful to her later. As she got up to take a call in the other room, Adrian realized the encounter with Clara had opened more than old wounds. It had exposed a crack in his carefully curated life. And if he wasn't careful, both Tonia and Clara could become storms that would collide in his world sooner than he was ready for. Adrian's workday was a blur of meetings and phone calls he barely heard. His mind kept wandering back to the restaurant. By evening, he found himself driving there again, parking across the street like a man with no plan but too much pride to admit why he was there. He told himself he just wanted to know she was okay, that he was simply curious, but deep down, the truth gnawed at him. The moment he saw Clara emerge from the side door, her uniform swapped for a faded blue dress and a worn handbag slung over her shoulder, he stepped out of his car and called her name. She froze mid-step, her back stiffening before she slowly turned to face him. The same cold, unreadable expression from the night before was there, but now there was something else, a flicker of weariness in her eyes. "What do you want, Adrian?" she asked flatly. He tried to ease into the conversation, starting with small talk, but she cut him off. "You don't get to play concerned ex-husband after everything." When he asked about the pregnancy, her lips tightened into a thin line. "It's none of your business," she said, her voice sharp, before walking away. Adrian stood there, watching her retreat into the shadows of the street, his chest tight. He had expected anger, maybe even tears, but not this unshakable wall of distance. For a man used to controlling situations, the helplessness was infuriating. Yet, instead of walking away, he found himself even more determined to find out the truth. Clara arrived at work the next day, trying to push the encounter out of her mind. The restaurant's kitchen was a noisy, steamy chaos, clattering pans, sizzling oil, and the constant barking of orders from the head chef. But among her coworkers, the gossip had already begun. One of the junior waiters smirked as he leaned against the counter. "So Clara, who was the rich guy staring at you like you were the last drop of water in a desert?" another teased, making the others laugh. She kept her face calm, continuing to load trays with plates of steaming food, but her stomach twisted. She knew how quickly whispers could turn into stories, and how stories could ruin what little peace she had left. "Mind your own business," she muttered, but that only fed their curiosity. By the end of her shift, she had overheard at least 3 different versions of her supposed mystery man. In one, he was her baby's father. In another, he was trying to win her back. In yet another, he was a stranger she had charmed. When she finally stepped outside into the night air, Clara let out a shaky breath. The weight of the pregnancy, the financial struggle, and now Adrian's sudden reappearance all pressed heavily on her. She told herself she could ignore him. She had before, and she could again. But a part of her, the part she hated, remembered the way his voice had softened when he'd called her name. Adrian lay awake long after midnight, staring at the ceiling as rain tapped gently against the windows. He kept trying to do the math in his head, counting months, remembering dates. He thought back to the night before their divorce papers were signed, when Clara had asked to talk. They'd ended up in a heated argument, then in each other's arms, and for a brief moment, it had felt like the years of tension had fallen away. The next morning, she'd been gone without a word, and within a week, the divorce had been finalized. Now, seeing her pregnant and far along, he couldn't shake the possibility that the child might be his. The thought made him restless, pacing across the cold marble floor of his living room. If the baby wasn't his, then whose was it? And why was she working such a demanding job instead of being cared for by the father? The questions gnawed at him until they turned into an obsession. He decided he needed answers, not for closure, he told himself, but for truth. Yet, beneath that reasoning, he knew there was another motive. A part of him wasn't ready to accept that Clara had built a life, however difficult, without him in it. A week later, Adrian was in his office when his assistant mentioned seeing Clara at a small cafe with Daniel Ajayi. The name hit Adrian like a punch to the gut. Daniel wasn't just a business rival. He was the man Adrian had once suspected of having an affair with Clara. The man whose presence in their lives had been the final straw in their marriage. The image formed quickly in Adrian's mind. Daniel leaning across the table, whispering something to Clara as she smiled, her hand resting on her belly. The idea made his jaw tighten until his teeth ached. He barely made it through the rest of the day's meetings, distracted by flashes of imagined betrayal. It didn't matter that the divorce was years behind them. The thought of Daniel being connected to Clara in any way reopened old wounds. By the time night fell, Adrian had convinced himself that if the baby wasn't his, it had to be Daniel's. And that thought, that his greatest rival might be raising a child with the woman he had once loved, was something he couldn't and wouldn't let go unanswered. Tonia had been quiet since the night at the restaurant, but Adrian knew better than to mistake her silence for disinterest. She was observant, strategic, and always thinking 3 steps ahead. One evening, as they shared dinner in his penthouse, she casually brought up the pregnant waitress again. Her tone was light, almost teasing, but every word was a hook. "It's just interesting," she said, twirling her fork. "You see an ex, she's pregnant. She's working in some random place. Don't you think she might be trying to get your attention?" Adrian gave her a sharp look, but she only smiled, sipping her wine. Tonia leaned forward, lowering her voice as if she were sharing a secret. "Men like you, women never really let go. Maybe she's hoping you'll feel sorry for her. Maybe she wants to complicate your life." The suggestion was sly, poisonous, and effective. Adrian tried to dismiss it, but the seed was planted. Her words blurred with his own doubts, twisting in his mind until he began to question Clara's motives. What Tonia didn't say out loud was that she saw Clara as a threat. She wasn't interested in sharing Adrian's attention or, more importantly, his resources. The more Adrian thought about Clara, the more Tonia's position in his life felt unstable, and she was determined to keep it secure. By nudging his thoughts toward suspicion and resentment, she was laying the groundwork to make sure Clara stayed in his past, not his future. It was raining the night Adrian saw Clara again. He had left a late meeting in Lekki and found himself driving toward the restaurant without meaning to. As he approached, he saw her leaving, balancing a plastic bag of food in one hand and an umbrella in the other. She looked tired, not just from a pregnancy, but from a kind of weight that settled deep in the bones. A sudden gust of wind flipped her umbrella inside out, sending the rain cascading over her. Adrian slowed his car beside her, rolling down the window. "Get in," he said simply. She hesitated, her expression hardening. "I'm fine," she replied, even as the rain soaked her dress. "Clara, please," he urged, his voice quieter now. But she shook her head, stepping back from the car, as if proximity itself was dangerous. "You don't get to play the hero, Adrian," she said before walking away into the downpour. He sat there for a moment, watching her figure fade into the sheets of rain, torn between frustration and something softer he didn't want to name. By the time he drove off, he knew that simply ignoring her wasn't an option anymore, not when every encounter seemed to leave him with more questions than answers. A few days later, Adrian was in his office reviewing contracts when his secretary announced a visitor. To his surprise, it was Mrs. Bizi Adeyemi, Clara's mother. She walked in with the same commanding presence she'd had the first day he met her years ago, but there was a new, sharper edge in her eyes now. Without wasting time, she sat across from him and folded her hands on his desk. "Leave Clara alone," she said plainly. Adrian leaned back in his chair, startled by her directness. "I'm not trying to," he began, but she cut him off with a raised hand. "You've already done enough. You broke her once. If you keep digging into her life, you will break her again." There was no malice in her tone, only a fierce protectiveness. She went on to say that Clara was doing her best to rebuild, that the pregnancy had brought her a kind of fragile peace, and that Adrian's interference would only bring chaos. Before leaving, Mrs. Beasy leaned closer, her voice dropping. "If you keep chasing answers, you might find truths you won't be able to live with." She didn't elaborate, but her words stayed with him long after she left. For the first time, Adrian felt a flicker of hesitation. What if the truth really was worse than not knowing? Clara's next shift was brutal. The restaurant was understaffed, and the manager kept snapping at everyone. She moved from table to table without pause, her back aching and her ankles swelling under the weight she carried. By the time she stepped into the kitchen to grab a glass of water, her vision blurred. The next thing she knew, the world tilted, and everything went black. When she woke, she was in a hospital bed, the sound of steady beeping filling the room. Her eyes flickered open to find Adrian sitting in a chair beside her, his suit jacket draped over the backrest, his shirt sleeves rolled up. "You fainted," he said softly, as if speaking too loudly might scare her away. She opened her mouth to tell him to leave, but he was already explaining how he'd driven her here, how the doctor said it was exhaustion and dehydration. As she turned her head away, she caught sight of a file on the table, her medical chart left behind by a nurse. Adrian's eyes lingered on it too long before he looked away, but the damage was done. The boundaries she had fought to keep between them had been crossed, and she could feel him getting closer to the truth she wasn't ready to share. Adrian didn't mean to look. At least, that's what he told himself later. But when the nurse came in to check Clara's vitals and left the file carelessly at the edge of the bed, the pages almost seemed to pull his eyes toward them. His gaze scanned over the routine notes until it landed on a small printed image, a blurry grayscale ultrasound photo. Beside it, in neat block letters, was the gestational age and date. Adrian's mind began working instantly, calculating backward. The date aligned almost perfectly with the last time they had been together before the divorce. His pulse quickened, the low hum of the hospital air conditioner suddenly sounding like a roar in his ears. He had convinced himself for years that their last night together had been nothing more than a moment of weakness. But now it looked like it might have been the beginning of something far greater, and something he had missed entirely. He looked at Clara, who was pretending to be asleep, though he could see the slight tension in her jaw. For a moment, he thought about confronting her directly, blurting out what he had just realized. But something in her stillness stopped him. This wasn't the time. She was pale, her breathing shallow, and the dark circles under her eyes told him she'd been pushing herself far beyond her limits. Yet beneath the exhaustion, there was a quiet defiance, the same spirit that had once made him fall in love with her. He realized she wasn't going to hand him the truth. If he wanted answers, he'd have to earn them. When a nurse returned to adjust her for, Adrian excused himself, but his mind was far from settled. The ultrasound date burned into his memory like an accusation. He thought about the years he had spent resenting her, the endless nights replaying the fight that had ended their marriage. If the baby was his, then he had walked away from Clara at her most vulnerable, without even knowing it. And that possibility that he might have abandoned his own child before they were even born made his chest ache with a guilt so deep it was almost unbearable. By the time Adrian got home that evening, Tonia was waiting for him. She was still in her silk robe, a glass of wine in hand, her expression cool, but her eyes sharp. "I heard you were at the hospital today," she said, without preamble. Adrian froze, realizing too late that his absence from work had already been noticed. "I had business to handle," he replied evenly, but she wasn't buying it. "Business doesn't wear a nurse's perfume," she snapped, her voice rising just enough to cut the air between them like glass. She pressed on, her words laced with venom. You think I don't know it's about her? You've been acting strange ever since that night at the restaurant. Don't tell me you suddenly care about some pregnant ex-wife who, she stopped herself, but the contempt in her tone was unmistakable. Adrian's jaw tightened. He didn't want to explain, didn't want to defend himself, and especially didn't want to give her the satisfaction of knowing how much Clara's situation was affecting him. The silence between them stretched, each second heavy with unspoken accusations. Finally, Tonia's mask cracked, revealing the insecurity underneath her poise. If you walk back into her life, you'll regret it, she said, her voice trembling slightly now. She's not the woman you think she is. Adrian met her gaze, but instead of answering, he simply turned and walked toward his study, leaving her standing there in the dim glow of the living room. Tonia's nails dug into the stem of her wine glass as she watched him go, a dangerous resolve settling in her eyes. She had no intention of letting Clara take what she had worked so hard to claim. The next morning, Adrian's focus was ripped from his personal turmoil by a crisis in his business. One of his flagship hotels had been hit with a sudden brutal public relations blow, a leaked video showing supposed health violations in the kitchen, along with accusations of staff mistreatment. Within hours, social media was ablaze, bookings began to drop, and investors were calling, demanding answers. Adrian knew the timing was too perfect to be coincidence. And in his world, only one man would strike this surgically, Daniel Ajayi. The name alone made his blood heat. Daniel had a history of using personal information to weaken his enemies, and Adrian knew that if Daniel had any connection to Clara, even a small one, he would use it to his advantage. His mind raced with the image of Daniel and Clara together at that cafe, and the possibility that his ex-wife might unknowingly be tangled in this mess. The thought of her being used as a pawn made his stomach turn, though he wasn't sure if it was anger at Daniel or guilt that he had let her drift into a life where Daniel could reach her. Adrian spent the rest of the day in war mode, summoning his legal team, investigating the source of the leak, and preparing to counterstrike. But even as he worked, part of his mind kept circling back to Clara. If Daniel's hand was truly behind this, then she was in the middle of a much bigger game than she realized, and Adrian knew games like this always left someone bleeding. When Adrian finally cornered Clara after her shift a few nights later, she was too tired to fight him off. They ended up sitting in the quiet back corner of the restaurant after closing, the smell of cleaning chemicals lingering in the air. I saw the scan date, he said quietly. She didn't flinch, but her fingers tightened around the mug of tea she was holding. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, with a deep breath, she began to speak, not in anger, but in a weary, measured tone. She told him she had tried to reach him after that night they were together, but every call had been intercepted. She had sent letters he never replied to, and when she finally showed up at his office, she had been turned away. At first, Adrian thought she was exaggerating, until she mentioned a name, Tonia. Clara claimed that during their marriage's final months, Tonia had been the one whispering poison into Adrian's ear, feeding him doubts, making sure they never truly reconciled. Adrian's chest tightened as pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. I didn't tell you about the baby because by the time I realized I was pregnant, I knew you wouldn't believe me, Clara finished, her voice trembling now. You were gone, Adrian. Not just physically, you were gone from us. The word has hit him like a blow. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of all he had lost, not just in their marriage, but in trust. He left the restaurant that night with more than answers. He left with the crushing knowledge that his betrayal had not been entirely his own making. Adrian didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study, replaying every conversation with Tonia, every moment she had subtly pushed him away from Clara, every time she had just happened to know something that fueled his suspicions. By morning, he was on the phone with his most trusted private investigator, demanding every detail of Tonia's past. Within hours, the truth came back like a punch to the gut. Tonia had known Daniel long before she met Adrian. She had been in his orbit for years, a frequent guest at his business events, and most damning of all, She had received several large bank transfers from one of Daniel's shell companies in the months leading up to Adrian's divorce. The pieces fit together with sickening precision. Tonia had been planted in Adrian's life to weaken his focus, to feed him lies about Clara, and to make sure the marriage never recovered. Daniel's vendetta had been personal as well as professional. Destroying Adrian's marriage was just as satisfying to him as damaging his business. Adrian's hands curled into fists as he thought about how easily he had been manipulated, how willingly he had believed the worst about Clara. The truth was a bitter thing, but it was also liberating. Now he had a target, and he had no intention of letting either Tonia or Daniel walk away unscathed. That evening, Adrian confronted Tonia in the penthouse. She tried to play innocent, but when he laid the evidence in front of her, the bank records, the photographs of her with Daniel before they met, her expression hardened. "So what if I did?" she hissed. "You think you're untouchable? Daniel made sure you learned the truth about the kind of man you really are." Her words were meant to sting, but Adrian felt nothing but cold determination. "Get out," he said, his voice low and final. For the first time since they met, Tonia looked afraid. Daniel didn't flinch when Adrian walked into his office unannounced the next day. The older man leaned back in his chair, a smug smile playing on his lips, as if he had been expecting this visit. "Adrian," he drawled, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" But the smirk faded when Adrian threw a thick folder onto his desk, proof of Tonia's betrayal, proof of Daniel's sabotage of the hotel chain, and enough to put him in the crosshairs of several regulatory agencies. "I don't care about your games with me," Adrian said, his voice like steel. "But you stay away from Clara. You use her name again even once, and I will burn everything you've built to the ground." Daniel's eyes narrowed, but there was no retort. The power dynamic had shifted. Adrian had come prepared, and Daniel knew it. Without waiting for a reply, Adrian turned and walked out, his mind already moving toward the next step, repairing what could be salvaged with Clara. That night, Adrian drove to the small apartment building where Clara lived. He didn't ask to come inside. He simply stood at the bottom of the steps and told her what he had discovered, that she had been right about Tonia all along, and that he was sorry. The apology was awkward, raw, and incomplete, but it was real. Clara listened in silence, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she simply said, "It's too late for sorry, Adrian." But her voice, while guarded, didn't slam the door on him entirely. It was 2 weeks later, during a heavy Lagos rainstorm, that Adrian's phone rang. It was one of Clara's coworkers from the restaurant, panic in her voice. Clara had gone into labor unexpectedly and was struggling to get to the hospital. Without thinking, Adrian grabbed his keys and drove through the flooded streets, his heart pounding with urgency. He found her by the roadside, hunched over and clutching her belly, her clothes plastered to her skin by the rain. There was no time to argue. He helped her into the car, but they barely made it a few kilometers before the traffic jam became impossible. The storm had flooded several roads, trapping them in place. Clara's contractions were coming faster, her breaths short and panicked. Adrian realized with a jolt that they weren't going to make it to the hospital in time. In the dim interior of the car, he improvised, wrapping his suit jacket around her, encouraging her to push, his voice calm despite the chaos inside him. Minutes later, the cry of a newborn filled the air, cutting through the drumming rain. Adrian held the tiny, slippery body in his hands, overwhelmed by the rush of life and responsibility. He wrapped the baby in his jacket and handed her to Clara, who was exhausted but still managed a weak smile. In that moment, nothing else existed, not Daniel, not Tonia, not the past. Just them and the fragile new life between them. At the hospital later that night, Adrian stood by the bed, watching Clara cradle their daughter. The baby's tiny fingers curled around Clara's thumb, and the sight lodged something deep in Adrian's chest. He had made mistakes, unforgivable ones, but he knew he wanted to spend the rest of his life making them right. He took a deep breath and said quietly, "Clara, I don't want to lose you again. Let me be here. For her. For you." Clara looked at him for a long time, her eyes searching his. There was hesitation there, and pain, but also something softer, a flicker of the trust they had once shared. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she admitted, her voice breaking. "But I never stopped loving you." The words weren't a promise, but they were a beginning, and Adrian felt the weight in his chest ease for the first time in years. As dawn broke over the city, the rain finally stopped, leaving the streets glistening under the pale light. Adrian stood at the hospital window, watching the world wake up, knowing his own life was starting over. This time, he vowed, he wouldn't let pride or lies steal it away. Behind him, Clara's soft humming to their daughter filled the room, a sound that, for the first time in a long while, made him believe in second chances. Please subscribe, like, and share. Thank you for watching.